A newlywed couple on their honeymoon in Hawaii where everything seems like a perfect paradise until they discover a killer couple is on the loose. As paranoia sets in, the real question is, who can they really trust? The story begins with a newlywed couple, Cliff and Sydney, who love adventure. To have an unforgettable honeymoon, they decide to take a road trip to a scenic Hawaiian island. Halfway through their journey, they notice a strange couple on the roadside waving at them. Cliff instinctively begins to slow down. However, Sydney, being cautious, quickly warns him that it's best not to pick up strangers when traveling. While they're discussing this, the strange couple catches up and asks Cliff and Sydney for a ride. Cliff notices the man is covered in tattoos and looks intimidating, which makes him feel uneasy. He politely declines their request, claiming they're not heading in the same direction. The tattooed man, Kiele, sensing the lie, gives them a menacing look before angrily walking away. Cliff and Sydney soon reach their destination, a picturesque mountain forest. Since the rugged mountain path is inaccessible by car, they park at the base and continue on foot. As they walk along a narrow path by a steep cliff, Sydney, walking behind Cliff, slips and nearly falls off. Luckily, a fellow tourist named Nick grabs her just in time, preventing a tragedy. Grateful, Cliff and Sydney thank Nick and invite him to join them. As they chat along the way, Nick learns that Cliff is a screenwriter and becomes visibly excited. He's a die-hard movie fan, especially fond of mystery films. He eagerly asks Cliff what scripts he's worked on. Cliff awkwardly admits that he's new to the industry and hasn't had any scripts produced yet. While walking, the trio encounters 3 young women traveling together on the island. The girls appear anxious. They just received a call from family warning them about a murder that happened on a nearby island. The victims were a newlywed couple on their honeymoon, and the killers, believed to be a man and a woman, are still at large. The girls' families urge them to return home quickly, fearing they might run into the murderers. The girls tried to verify the news online, but due to weak cell signals, they couldn't load any pages. Hearing this unsettling news, Cliff and Sydney feel a growing sense of dread, especially since they too are a honeymooning couple. Cliff even considers cutting the trip short and heading back. However, Sydney, still enthusiastic about the adventure, refuses to give up. She argues that the island is full of other tourists, and even if the murder story is true, the killers wouldn't dare strike here. Seeing Sydney's determination and with Nick appearing unfazed, Cliff reluctantly agrees to continue. For safety, he invites the 3 girls to join them, but after learning Cliff and Sydney are also a newlywed couple, the girls panic. They fear the killers might target another honeymooning couple and quickly decline the invitation. Nick, still skeptical that such a crime could happen in broad daylight, suggests taking Cliff and Sydney to a beautiful waterfall nearby. Along the way, Cliff and Sydney learn that Nick had been on the mountain earlier and had only gone back to his car at the base to fetch some supplies. They also find out that Nick isn't alone. He's traveling with his fiancée Gina. When they finally reach the secluded waterfall, they see a young woman swimming in the pool below. It's Gina. Sydney, carefree and excited, quickly joins Gina in the water while Cliff stays behind, preoccupied. He climbs to the top of the waterfall to check his phone for a signal and search for news about the murder. A faint signal finally appears, allowing him to load a news page. Sure enough, there's an article about the murder on a nearby island. The report details how the killers cruelly removed the victims' teeth and destroyed their fingerprints to make identification difficult. At the end of the article, there's a surveillance image of the suspects. Cliff waits impatiently for the image to load, but the weak signal causes it to stall. Just then, Cliff accidentally spotted the strange couple he had refused to give a ride to earlier. They appeared right in front of him, clearly looking displeased. Kiele stepped forward and angrily questioned Cliff, asking why he had said he was going a different way and how they had still ended up meeting there. Faced with the tall, burly man, the slim and timid Cliff grew fearful and could only apologize repeatedly. But Kiele wouldn't let it go and kept pestering him. Luckily, Nick arrived just in time and helped Cliff out of the situation. To avoid further conflict, Cliff, Nick, Sydney, and Nick's fiancée, Gina, decided to leave the waterfall and head to a nearby beach instead. While packing up their backpacks, Sydney suddenly realized that both hers and Cliff's park permits were missing. Without the permits, they wouldn't be able to access some areas on the island. As Sydney panicked, Cliff noticed Kiele's backpack lying nearby. He suspected that the couple had stolen their permits out of spite. Cliff quietly searched the backpack but found no permits. Aside from travel gear and food, he discovered a fake military officer's business card. This led Cliff to suspect that Kiele might be an ex-convict pretending to be a soldier. It explained the man's aggressive demeanor, acting like some kind of rogue hero. Since he found no permits, Cliff carefully placed the backpack back and followed Nick and Gina towards the beach. On the way, Nick started bragging to Cliff and Sydney about his past as a retired Special Forces soldier. He talked about completing many dangerous missions and even showed them a scar on the back of his head, where a titanium plate had been implanted after shrapnel removed part of his skull. He also revealed the sharp military knife he always carried. Hearing Nick proudly share these violent tales, Cliff and Sydney felt increasingly uneasy, suspecting that Nick might have violent tendencies. They used the excuse of needing a bathroom break to distance themselves from Nick and Gina. Taking the opportunity, Cliff reopened the murder report on his phone. This time, the suspect's photo had fully loaded. It showed a man and a woman, though the blurry angle and low resolution made their faces hard to distinguish. Still, Cliff couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the photo looked like Nick. He quietly suggested to Sydney that they find an opportunity to separate from Nick and Gina as soon as possible. Soon after, dark clouds rolled in and heavy rain began to pour. With nightfall approaching, the four of them had no choice but to set up camp and wait for the storm to pass before continuing to the beach the next day. Later, behind the tent, Nick took out a crossbow and invited Cliff to go hunting in the nearby woods. Cliff initially refused, but Nick goaded him into joining, so Cliff reluctantly grabbed an axe and followed. The dense forest, with its winding paths and thick foliage, made it easy to get separated. Soon, Cliff lost sight of Nick. Alone and anxious, he suddenly heard footsteps behind him. Panicking, Cliff turned and tackled the person, only to realize it was a false alarm. The person was a store clerk from the shop at the mountain's base. The clerk explained that Cliff and Sydney had accidentally left their park permits at the store when they bought supplies earlier. Wanting to help, the clerk had hiked up the mountain to return them. Relieved, Cliff apologized and thanked the clerk before rushing back to the camp. Not long after, Nick also returned, carrying a wild mountain goat over his shoulders. Without hesitation, Gina grabbed Nick's military knife and expertly skinned, gutted, and deboned the goat. Watching the gory scene unfold, Cliff and Sydney felt chills run down their spines. Seeing their discomfort, Gina casually explained that she used to work in the fresh meat department at a supermarket for years, so she was skilled at butchering. Despite her explanation, Cliff and Sydney couldn't shake their growing unease. They began to suspect that Nick and Gina might actually be the real killers, but without a good excuse to leave and with night fully set in, they decided to wait until morning to make their move. The next morning, the four were startled awake by the loud whirring of helicopter blades. They followed the sound to a nearby clearing where a helicopter was landing, and several police officers disembarked. To Cliff and Sydney's shock, the police immediately arrested Kiele and his girlfriend, who were nearby. It turned out someone had reported them as the murderers. Upon searching their backpacks, the police found a bloody pair of pliers and several teeth belonging to the victims. With such solid evidence, Kiele and his girlfriend were escorted onto a plane by the police and taken away from the island. Seeing this, Cliff and Sydney breathed a huge sigh of relief. Nick and his girlfriend Gina also showed a look of immense relief. In fact, they had once suspected that Cliff and Sydney were the real murderers. Now that the true culprits were caught, the misunderstanding between the four was resolved. They all let their guards down and continued traveling together. Along the way, Sydney filmed many beautiful sceneries with her video camera. Before long, the four of them arrived at a quiet beach. After chatting casually for a while, Cliff took the initiative to invite Nick to go boating and explore a nearby sea cave. These sea caves were formed by years of waves eroding the seaside cliffs. Nick wasn't particularly interested, but couldn't refuse Cliff's enthusiasm. Eventually, the two rented a small boat and rowed toward the sea cave with Cliff leading the way. Back on the shore, Gina wanted Sydney to record a video of Nick and Cliff rowing. However, Sydney had just left the beach, seemingly heading to the restroom. So Gina picked up the video camera Sydney had left on the sand. She first filmed Nick and Cliff on the boat and then began watching some of the scenic videos Sydney had recorded. While browsing, Gina accidentally came across footage from Cliff and Sydney's wedding. Watching it with interest, her expression suddenly turned to horror. She immediately threw the camera aside and shouted for Nick to come back quickly. But Nick was already too far from the shore and couldn't hear her. Gina frantically tried to call him, only to realize there was no phone signal. In desperation, she grabbed an axe and ran along the beach towards the sea cave. What had she seen? In the wedding footage, although the couple introduced themselves as Cliff and Sydney, they were not the same people Nick and Gina had been traveling with. Gina instantly realized that the couple they'd been accompanying were the real murderers. They had killed the newlyweds, Cliff and Sydney, and stolen their identities. As Gina sprinted toward the sea cave, the woman posing as Sydney returned from the restroom. Spotting the dropped video camera, the imposter, Sydney, instantly understood what had happened. She immediately started chasing after Gina. Meanwhile, Nick and the fake Cliff had already arrived at the sea cave. Awestruck by the natural beauty of the place, Nick recited a few famous movie lines about the sea. To his surprise, the fake Cliff, who had claimed to be a screenwriter, had no reaction. This raised Nick's suspicions once again. Sensing he had been exposed, the imposter Cliff dropped his act. He pulled a gun from his pocket and aimed it at Nick's head, beginning to share his twisted thoughts about his crimes. Nick finally learned the truth. The man wasn't Cliff but Rocky, and the woman with him was his psychotic and meth addict girlfriend. Rocky and the fake Sydney were the real killers of the newlywed couple, Cliff and Sydney. After murdering them, they assumed their identities. Rocky had a deeply twisted mind and had been obsessed since childhood with experiencing different lives. To fulfill this desire, he murdered strangers and lived under their identities. The fake Sydney, madly in love with Rocky, willingly became his accomplice. The reason the muscular and tattooed man, Kiele, and his girlfriend were arrested was also Rocky's doing. He had secretly planted blood-stained pliers in a victim's teeth in the man's backpack. Then, he tipped off a shop clerk delivering park permits, claiming Kiele was acting suspiciously, prompting the police to arrest him. At the beginning of the trip, Rocky and his girlfriend had acted nervous and fearful, even suggesting they part ways with Nick and Gina. They did this for two reasons: to maintain the facade of being Cliff and Sydney, and to avoid suspicion, especially from Nick, a former Special Forces soldier. Once Kiele and his girlfriend were taken away, Nick and Gina fully let their guard down. That's when Rocky decided it was time to kill them. He was bored with Cliff's identity as a screenwriter and wanted to experience life as a retired Special Forces soldier. After revealing his twisted motives, Rocky pulled the trigger without hesitation. Nick, unable to dodge in time, was shot in the head and sank into the water. At that very moment, Gina reached the top of the sea cave and witnessed Nick being killed. Rocky noticed her and quickly aimed his gun at her, firing several shots. Luckily, the distance between them was too great and Gina managed to avoid the bullets. But before she could catch her breath, the fake Sydney caught up with her and tackled her to the ground. The axe Gina had been carrying slipped from her hands and fell onto the boat below. Seeing Gina unarmed, the fake Sydney pulled out a small knife and lunged at her again. In a desperate move, Gina dodged just in time, causing the fake Sydney to overextend and lose her balance, falling into the sea below. However, before falling, the fake Sydney managed to stab Gina in the thigh. Despite the pain, Gina pulled out the knife and limped toward the edge of the cave, wanting to check on Nick after he was shot. Fearing that Rocky might still be inside and could shoot her, she didn't dare to stick her head out to look. Instead, she raised her phone and took a picture inside the cave. To her shock, Rocky was nowhere to be seen. Nick had already sunk into the water, leaving only the rented boat floating on the surface. Gina continued searching along the cliffside, desperately hoping to find Nick. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was just a telemarketer. But that's when she realized her phone finally had a signal. As she was about to call the police, a hand suddenly reached up from below the cliff and grabbed her ankle. Looking down in horror, Gina saw Rocky climbing up the cliff barehanded. In her panic, she dropped her phone, watching helplessly as it plummeted down. Regaining her composure, she gripped the knife tightly and stabbed Rocky's other hand, which was gripping the edge. As Rocky winced in pain, she seized the opportunity to break free and escape. But Rocky, despite his injury, managed to climb up and continued chasing her. With her thigh still bleeding, Gina couldn't run far before exhaustion set in. Thankfully, she stumbled upon 4 lifeguards. Before she could explain what was happening, Rocky caught up and, without missing a beat, lied, claiming Gina was his friend's wife who had taken drugs and was hallucinating. The lifeguards were skeptical of Rocky's story. Realizing his lie wasn't working, Rocky pulled out his gun and shot all 4 of them. He then turned his attention back to Gina, but when he tried to fire, he discovered the gun was empty. As he reloaded the magazine, something unexpected happened. Nick, who had been shot and fallen into the water, suddenly reappeared, like a warrior returning from the dead, holding the axe Gina had dropped onto the boat earlier. He swung the axe down at Rocky, who instinctively raised his gun-wielding hand to block. The axe cleaved through Rocky's right hand, splitting it in 2. It turned out that when Rocky had first shot Nick had slightly tilted his head thanks to his Special Forces instincts. The bullet had struck a titanium plate in his skull, which saved his life, though it knocked him unconscious. After waking up, Nick had swum to shore, retrieved the axe, and arrived just in time to save Gina. Nick grabbed Rocky's now loaded gun, ready to finish him off. But before he could pull the trigger, a police helicopter arrived, with the fake Sydney inside. It turned out the earlier gunfire had alerted other tourists on the island, who had called the police. When they arrived, they found the fake Sydney floating in the water and rescued her. The fake Sydney had pretended to be a victim, tricking the police. From the helicopter, the fake Sydney saw Nick aiming the gun at Rocky. The police, misunderstanding the situation, thought Nick was the murderer. A sniper locked onto Nick, while the police ordered him to drop his weapon. Seeing Nick in danger, Gina bravely stepped between him and the sniper's scope, forcing Nick to come to his senses. He threw the gun to the ground. From the helicopter, the fake Sydney watched the scene unfold, her emotions in turmoil. Perhaps she had grown tired of the endless violence and running, or maybe she was moved by Nick and Gina's love. After a moment of hesitation, the fake Sydney finally pointed to Rocky, revealing him as the real murderer. Rocky, still alive, made one last desperate attempt to grab the fallen gun, but the police sniper shot him dead on the spot. In the end, the fake Sydney confessed all her crimes to the police, bringing her life on the run to a close. As for Nick, he mustered his courage, took out a ring he had been carrying, and proposed to Gina. She happily accepted but made one simple request: no more honeymoon trips. The film's biggest twist is its unconventional storytelling, presenting the story from the killer's perspective, much like a detective novel where the detective turns out to be the murderer. Although the twist fooled many first-time viewers, the technique isn't particularly groundbreaking. The filmmakers went to great lengths to add ambiguous details throughout the film, making it enjoyable for a second viewing.